Trump did over the weekend was remove Maduro. But as has become increasingly clear, he has left the rest of the regime in place. Trump has attacked Maria Carina Machado, the leader of the Democratic opposition, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and basically said he wants to work with Delcy Rodriguez, the Venezuelan vice president. It's a policy that really has no logical basis for it, and it reflects Trump's very confused decision making. So I think if we had used enough economic power against Venezuela and the Maduro regime back in Trump's first term, the regime might have fallen then. Trump has a fascination with tangible things that he can understand and grasp. He has much more difficulty with bigger national security, geostrategic concepts. Oil issue in Venezuela is obviously important to him. Politically now in the United States, because he wants to keep the price of gasoline at the pump, as we say, what consumers pay, as low as possible.
First of all, I'll ask you, how do you assess recent political developments in Venezuela, as you were closely involved in shaping US policy towards Venezuela during the Trump administration?
Well, I think it's in the interest of the United States, for very important reasons, to remove the Maduro regime from power in Venezuela and return the government of that country to its people. That was what we tried to do in Trump's first term, unfortunately unsuccessfully. What Trump did over the weekend was remove Maduro, but as has become increasingly clear, he has left the rest of the regime in place. Trump has attacked Maria Carina Machado, the leader of the Democratic opposition, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and basically said he wants to work with Delcy Rodriguez, the Venezuelan vice president and a key supporter of Maduro. I think that's just going to lead to the worst of both possible worlds. We will still have the regime with all the troubles that it causes and the threats that it poses, and yet the people of Venezuela will still be left out in the cold. It's a policy that really has no logical basis for it, and it reflects Trump's very confused decision making.
Ambassador, the Trump administration tied energy policy closely to geopolitics, particularly in Latin America. Do you still believe that leveraging oil production and sanctions was the right strategic approach?
Well, I think if we had used enough economic power against Venezuela and the Maduro regime back in Trump's first term, the regime might have fallen then. Trump has a fascination with tangible things that he can understand and grasp. He has much more difficulty with bigger national security, geostrategic concepts. You know, he used to say how opposed he was to the Iraq War overthrowing Saddam Hussein, but then often said, but of course, if we had gotten their oil, it would have been all right. And so I think that the oil issue in Venezuela is obviously important to him politically now in the United States, because he wants to keep the price of gasoline at the pump, as we say, what consumers pay, as low as possible.
So, what legal or diplomatic ramifications would arise if a foreign power captures or deposes a sitting head of state like Maduro? How does international law view such an action? And with ongoing debates over presidential decision-making authority, do you think the institutional balance between the White House, Congress needs reform, as some argued that Congress wasn't notified about this?
Well, let's take the international law aspects first. You know, it's been the U.S. position for quite some time, again, going back to Trump's first term, when Maduro stole the 2018 presidential election. The Venezuelan National Assembly declared the office of the presidency vacant because the election was stolen, and named Juan Guaido interim president. We then recognized Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela, and justified our support in the opposition's efforts to overthrow the Maduro regime as simply trying to put the legitimate government back in place. In other words, Maduro was a usurper. He wasn't the legitimate head of Venezuela. The circumstances are a little bit different now, but not that much different. 6 years later, in 2024, Maduro steals that year's presidential election, and Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition leader who won is the legitimate president of Venezuela, and he and Maria Carina Machado have supported U.S. efforts to oust the Maduro regime. So we're not going after a legitimate head of state. We're going after a rogue leader of a basically a criminal gang that's ruled Venezuela, sadly now for almost 30 years. So I think what we did, and what we did, hopefully in some coordination with the opposition, was within international law. Now, on the separate question of what is required of a president under the Constitution of the U.S., Congress has the power to declare war. That is to say, to state that war exists between the U.S. and another combatant. It helps define the legal relationships between the combatants, between the combatants and their allies, the combatants and their trading partners, and others. But Congress does not have the power to make war. The framers specifically considered that and limited Congress's role to declaring war. And really, it goes back to the very beginning of the country. The president's commander in chief and his authority to use force when necessary is clearly within the limits of the Constitution. You can debate the wisdom, the political prudence of acting without going to Congress first. And this case is a good example of that, where Congress felt left out, and now there's a lot of opposition in Congress for that reason. But that's a political and prudential question. It's not a constitutional question.
Mhm. So Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, but exports have been heavily affected by sanctions and recent actions by the United States. How might these latest military and political developments further disrupt Venezuela's oil production and exports?
Well, with oil at between $55 and $60 a barrel, the loss of production from Venezuela into international markets is insignificant. The real problem with the oil industry in Venezuela is that over now nearly 30 years of the Chavez-Maduro dictatorship, they have looted the state oil company, PDVSA as it's called. And PDVSA has not, over a long period of time, improved, modernized, kept its oil infrastructure in good repair. So one reason today, apart from the sanctions, that Venezuela produces so little oil is that its drilling and shipping and other capacities are so degraded. They're so dilapidated. And here's where Trump makes another fundamental mistake by thinking that foreign investment by U.S. or other foreign oil companies can suddenly or quite quickly increase Venezuela's oil production is absolutely wrong. This is going to take billions of dollars of new capital investment over an extended period of time before there's any real impact on Venezuelan production.
Mhm. Okay, so now I'll ask you something on Iran. Your views on Iran. Recent statements from President Trump signaled potential U.S. intervention if Iranian authorities violently suppress protesters. He said that the U.S. is locked and loaded. Do you think such threats help or backfire in terms of its strategic objectives and Iranian public sentiment?
Well, I think what probably got the attention of the Ayatollahs more than anything else was the capture of Maduro. They should be worried. But I think it's better to act and rather than engage in rhetoric like Trump does. If you look at the situation in Iran now, the anti-regime demonstrations are continuing and expanding. And there are indications that at the top of the Iranian regime, it's really beginning to come apart. I have long believed that the regime is deeply unpopular with big segments of the Iranian population. It could come to a crisis when the Ayatollah Khamenei dies. He's only the second supreme leader since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And at a time of the succession crisis, like I think Iran would have then, that's when the regime would be very weak. But it's under enormous pressure now. And I think this is a time where the US and others should be consulting with the Iranian opposition and saying, what can we do to help? Does it help to make statements like Trump made, or should we just remain silent and help you, the opposition, in other ways? I think there's a real opportunity here. I'd love to see the regime of the Ayatollahs fall. And again, let the people of Iran decide what kind of government they want.
Mhm. Ambassador, in comments reported after the Venezuelan operation, Trump not only highlighted Venezuela but also mentioned other countries, including Cuba, Colombia, Greenland, Mexico, implying the US might take decisive actions beyond its border. How do you make of such statements?
Well, I think this is a lot of hot air. This is Trump talking. You know, he said to me several times when I was in the White House, I'm a talker. I like to talk. And that's what he does. He talks endlessly. The different situations he mentioned really are distinct from one another. I think Cuba is the most important to focus on because the government, the post Castro regime in Havana, is very worried that if the Maduro regime falls, their regime might be next. And I think they're right to be afraid. These two countries depend on one another. They're mutually reinforcing, along with the Ortega regime in Nicaragua. I call them the troika of tyranny in the Western Hemisphere in Trump's first term. And if there, as these three governments lean on one another, if one of them collapses, the other two could collapse too. I think obviously Secretary of State Marco Rubio, being a Cuban American himself, has led the effort to overthrow the Maduro regime, and he certainly hopes that the post Castro regime in Cuba will fall as well.
Mhm. So, talking about India now, President Trump recently claimed that Prime Minister Modi knew he wasn't happy and with India buying Russian oil and suggested tariffs could rise quickly if India did not align with US expectations. How do you assess the strategic logic of tying US trade policy and tariff threats directly to India's energy discussions, and especially at a time when two countries are negotiating a trade deal?
Well, I think it helps show why Trump really doesn't have any strategic sense at all for what's in America's best interest. Talking about taking over Greenland is contributing to disarray within the NATO alliance and really could cause it permanent damage at a time when we're faced with an enormous threat from China and its hegemonic aspirations all along its Indo-Pacific perimeter. We need to be working with India, with Japan, with South Korea, with Taiwan, with others against that threat. But Trump is just obsessed with these tariffs and the sale of oil, and yet he has added a tariff to India, but not a tariff to China, which purchases considerably more Russian oil, or to other countries like Turkey that purchases a lot of Russian oil. So I think it's caused real trouble in the U.S. India relations. I think it's a self inflicted wound by Trump himself. And I wish there were some way we could get him and Modi talking directly again and see if they could find a solution. I think Trump believes he has a very good personal relationship with Modi, and maybe that's a way to get this crisis behind us.
Yeah. Ambassador Bolton, just last two questions, sir. The Russia Ukraine war has entered a prolonged and costly phase. From your perspective, has Western strategy towards Ukraine been effective? And since President Trump has repeatedly claimed the war would not have happened under his presidency, do you agree with this assessment?
Well, it's hard to say. I think to take your second question first, uh, Russia's first invasion was in 2014, and I think they were getting ready for a second invasion. They had a lot to do to try and beef their forces up. They were unsuccessful, as we can see, and after the 2022 invasion. But I think the crisis would have come about that point, whether Trump was president still, or whether, as turned out, Biden got elected. Uh, uh, but what Putin has been able to do now is stonewall Trump. He's refused repeatedly to agree to a peace deal, notwithstanding Trump is basing part of his campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize on reaching agreement between the two countries. I'm skeptical anything will come of it. There's a big meeting of European leaders today with Zelensky of Ukraine in Paris on the latest discussions about a possible Ukraine-Russia deal. We'll see what comes out of it, but I'm pretty skeptical, and I think that overall. Trump is his activities are really focused on what it takes to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he has a short attention span, and he moves from one thing to another very quickly.
Mhm. Ambassador Bolton, just one last question, sir. If you were advising the White House today, what would be your top three priorities for 2026?
Well, I would worry about the threat from China. I think that's the top priority, really, for the rest of the world in the 21st century. We've seen continued growth in Chinese military power. I think it poses a clear threat to peace and security in the South China Sea and in and around Taiwan and along the line of actual control with India. So I think China tops the list. I think that Russia, which is, as we've just discussed, conducting an aggressive war in Ukraine, would be the second. And I think Iran and North Korea would tie for third because of their continuing threats in the case of Iran to develop nuclear weapons, and in the case of North Korea to improve and expand its arsenal. So it's a very dangerous world out there. There's a lot going on, a lot of threats to international peace and security that I think should require India and the U.S. to work much more closely together.